All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name's Jake Goldenfine. I'm an associate professor at the University of Melbourne at the Law School. Um, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this um, book talk with Mona Sloane and Pern Ceylon. Uh, Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that where I live and work is the unceded country of the Wurundjeri people. Sovereignty was never ceded over this land, and it's important that we continue to acknowledge that as we go ahead with our scholarship here. Uh, I also want to acknowledge that this event today is produced by Pern, which is the platform Economies Research Network. Pern is a wonderful intellectual community and network of scholars that are very interested in the different ways that value is constituted, justified, distributed in digital economies. It has been going for some time and is led by the wonderful Janet Reutman. And it began its life in New York at the New School, but currently has an institutional home here in Australia and is connected with ADM+S, which is the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, ADM+S as we call it, which is a multi-university, multidiscipline project that has been running since 2020 in Australia, exploring different effects of automation on a whole range of different topics. And I'm proud to be a chief investigator of that project. Now, with these Pern events, we typically have the Pern group participate in the discussion, primarily with Mona. And so we ask those visitors to remain with their cameras and microphones off while the discussion takes place. You can, of course, put questions into the chat, and we'll get to them in due course. Um, so I think we'll go ahead now and we'll get into it. I'm going to introduce Mona. Um, so Mona Sloane has a joint appointment as a professor in both media studies and data science at the University of Virginia, where she leads the Sloane Lab, which is a new and growing research lab exploring the sociological questions related to AI, both projects as well as governance tools. So Mona, her work involves social scientific analysis of particular AI applications, many of which are talked about in the book, things like AI procurement, AI hiring, AI procurement, and indeed AI in animation, which is a really fascinating study that she's done. And she also explores strategies that are used for the governance of AI, such as audits, impact assessments, and transparency tools. I think Mona's work relentlessly points out problems associated with giving control of the design process to overly technicized ways of seeing the world. And it is a very welcome corrective to that. There are no shortage of accolades for Mona. She's held numerous very prestigious fellowships. She's often found driving large-scale collaborative projects and wrangling all the people necessary to get those things going. She's a very frequent contributor to numerous publications and has been named in an Ethics Hall of Fame. And I think also, most importantly, Mona is a really generous scholar and active collaborator, all around excellent colleague and a very good friend. Mona founded, it's called the Co-opting series, which began as a series of talks in New York at NYU, which has now become a book series at the University of California Press. Indeed, UC Press is the imprint for her new book that we'll be discussing today, which is called Predicted: How AI is Restructuring Social Life, which I think is sure to sensitize a whole new generation of scholars, students, and practitioners into ways in which the social needs to be reasserted back into the predictive technologies that are organizing our social existence. So it's a really significant honor And it makes me really happy to introduce Mona here today to talk to us about her book, Predicted. So we'll begin. Mona can just give us an introduction for 10 minutes or so about the book, and then we'll get into the discussion. Perm members, once we've heard from Mona, then I encourage you to keep your microphones off, and we can chat freestyle, if you will, or if you feel more bound by the affordances of Zoom, then you can raise your hand if you like to, and I'll moderate the discussion. So without any further ado, thanks so much. Thanks for being here. Go ahead, Mona.
Thank you so much, Jake. Heartfelt thanks to you and Janet for having me. It's an absolute pleasure and honor. I just said it earlier, this is my very first book talk, so I'm a little nervous, but also incredibly grateful to be doing this for the first time with such a generous group. So I am bringing to you for the conversation sort of two of the biggest ideas that sort of undergird the book and that come out of almost a decade of research on these systems that we call artificial intelligence, which I claim are embedding a prediction paradigm into the organization of social life. But before I do that, I too want to acknowledge that I am living, learning, and working on the homeland and traditional territory of the Monacan Indian Nation. And that here at UVA, we acknowledge them as well as pay respect to the enslaved Africans, the enslaved laborers, and free Black laborers who built the University of Virginia, as well as their descendants. Now, the book starts with something that to folks who are social scientists, and especially who are STS scholars, find quite apparent and obvious, which is the notion that all technology is social and that AI is a way in which we express society or in which society is expressed. And that's sort of a really, that's the foil against which I sort of argue what I have to say in the book. And that's also something that I sort of always bring to the table when I work on empirical projects with technologists, data scientists, information scientists, but also practitioners in policy and governance. So technology is first and foremost social. The sort of bigger idea that I'm proposing is that the power that we ascribe to AI or that is flows from AI is oracular. So we're dealing with a sort of power that comes from prediction. Now, other than divination, prediction is old. So it's not a new thing, and it's not, of course, unique to AI, especially as a social practice. So other than divination, AI prediction is based on what I call a linear time regime. So the idea that there is a discrete past and a discrete future, and that the past, as sort of discrete unit, can predict that one future. So my idea is that the big threat that comes from AI isn't necessarily biased AI systems that, of course, can inflict harms, or the surveillance society and surveillance capitalism, but the sort of generalized acceptance and solidification of the idea that there is only one future that sits on a literally timeline, and that this future is machine predictable, and that thus those with the quote unquote means of prediction, and I borrow that from Max Cassie, who was an economist at Oxford, that those with the means of prediction not only can, but ought to lead us towards that future. So the linear time regime kind of implies that not only time is a line, and we sort of should save inches on it because we can use AI to save time and, have all the free time in the world and nobody has to work anymore and we need UEI. But it also sort of tries to tell us what we should do with those saved inches, which of course reminds of Weberian bureaucracy, with the little exception that the rules undergirding AI aren't as transparent. Now, I call the sort of social reorganization around the prediction paradigm, the prediction paradigm. And I'm kind of arguing that we are losing deliberation to the prediction paradigm. We're losing the idea that the future is not predictable. There's not only one future, there are multiple futures, and that we need to commune, to deliberate on what kind of future we may want, or different futures we may want. So I sort of describe AI as a culture phenomenon that is sort of anti-pluralism and anti-democracy, and that's what the sort of book ends on. The STS lens on this is working through the ways in which AI has become social infrastructure. So what I mean by that is that these predictive logics allow resources, ideas, and people to flow into certain directions and not others. That AI systems are in the background. They're melted into the already existing infrastructures that we have, both soft infrastructures and hard infrastructures, so institutions as well as literally the grid, for example. Um, and it is a social infrastructure, and that is a term I borrow from sociologist Eric Kleinenberg, because it is administering, it is managing, and it is directing social relationships. So we kind of suspect the logics of prediction everywhere, and we sort of shift ever so slightly, sometimes more obviously, our behaviors to sort of address that prediction. So when you have students who come up to you and ask for advice on what to do after graduation to land a job, some professors will say, well, you have to tweak your LinkedIn profile, or here are the things that you have to put on your CV so that the machine can read you and scan you better. All infrastructures are directional. So this directionality comes from this time regime, but also from the idea that AI is a classifying instrument. Of course, I'm not the first and only person who's arguing this. There are definitely important scholars in this group who have argued this as well. I sort of work through the ways in which infrastructures and AI prediction as an infrastructure is a scaling technology. So the ways in which it gets deployed with the idea that we need fewer human decision-making points, that machines can take those over. And I sort of land on the idea of standards and work through, for example, the motion capture study that Jake mentioned, work through how these standards actually point to social assumptions that we make about bodies, about people, and that we can pull these out and sort of unpack AI's black box a little bit. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A part. Now, of course, infrastructures are practiced. They're not just material instantiations. Again, I'm not the first person who's saying this, but I kind of come back to that point and to the point that all AI is social, because I worry that we are ceding ground to the idea that we can change our AI-infused world. That is, that it is happening to us, and that, for example, more recently, this is not in the book. This is it's a little bit in the book, but it sort of blew up more after I submitted the manuscript. When the AI bubble bursts, what will happen to the economy, for example? So the idea that AI is something that we practice, this is something that we therefore also can have a say in, is really important in the book. However, I sort of work through how some infrastructures are really hackable. I, for example, present a case study that my husband, who's a former archaeologist, keeps telling me about, where the Marmara Lake in Turkey had open canals and which is an infrastructure, of course, for irrigation, and farmers were sort of be able to tap into these open canals, and we're able to hack this infrastructure. Now the lake is completely dried out, so we can sort of see there what happens when we have a hackable infrastructure, that there's no sort of governance oversight to that hackable infrastructure. We can't even hack AI. We can sort of destroy AI a little bit. We can tinker with it, but we can't really hack it in the same way because it's completely sort of closed. That is now slightly changing. In the conclusion of the book, I sort of point to some instantiations in which we can see how certain governments have begun to think about AI as somewhat of a public infrastructure. At the completion of the manuscript, Switzerland, for example, came out with the first open source public AI model that was actually competitive with proprietary models in the US, and has open weights for example. So that's like a little bit of an opening up of that kind of infrastructure. So ultimately, my plea is to all of us that we understand that we have space for deliberation, and that we have space for deliberation about what an AI future can look like, and that we can think about what that would mean, for example, if we consider AI as a little bit of an instrument that can be useful in certain ways. And there are a few projects here at UVA and beyond, and especially in Sloane Lab, where we're trying to do that a little bit. This is sort of what I wanted to land on, and I hope that that was not too convoluted or complex. I just read my own work in preparation for this for the first time again after a little bit of time, and I hope I sort of was able to convey the bigger ideas in the book. And I see Mike Wilkes, who I know from NYU.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mona. So we will now open up to discussion. That was a very rich introduction. I've got a feeling we're going to get stuck into talking a bit more about some of the studies that you've done that have informed your analysis, and some of your more general sort of theoretical analyses as well. We're already getting some questions in the chat from the audience, but I was hoping that perhaps people from Pern might who have had access to the book might begin the conversation with some comments. So anyone in particular want to kick us off? A slow Friday morning start for some people.
Well, I'm happy to. That's
Sure.
I encourage so what I'm going to make sort of a general comment sort of question. So Mona, feel free to engage as you feel fit. And then maybe others actually other PERM members might have something to add to this. So please do. So sorry, I'm going to recap a little bit only because that's just the way my brain works. So like your basic point is that AI predictive systems are social infrastructure, like as you've just walked through. I was curious. I always think of Brian Larkin, who's in New York, and who wasn't present in the book, and just if you've looked at his work at all. And so, the point, the sort of overall point is that they are collective expressions of society. I'm sort of quoting that as like your takeaway quote in a way. And so as you say, and you just reviewed this a bit, like AI is often characterized as like a form of like deception, or I would say a monological form of agency, right? Like a means of surveillance, a system that reproduces or produces bias, reproduces bias, maybe is better. I think it's really helpful that you point out that this is an extremely reductive view. It's not like it's false, like there are moments we can show that's true, but it's very reductive. And I was very happy to see that. I don't often see that. And just a quote, because I thought this was a well put, AI's most powerful effect is this subtle yet comprehensive recalibration. That's the word I hesitated on, recalibration towards prediction as a guiding principle for organizing society. This is what you call the prediction paradigm, as you just told us. So the recalibration I thought was very helpful, right? This is like, instead of the reductive view, how are things being recalibrated? And this really welcome focused, and this is my own tendency to focus on effects with an E, right? Not some like causes, yeah, but like, what are the effects? So saying overall that really appreciating this move from a reductive view to a focus on recalibration towards prediction, right? That's potentially a really nicely open-ended approach, right? There are multiple effects, some of which are unintended or unexpected, and they pertain to like various domains of action or various domains of practice, right? So but then also when I would agree with you, what you ended on is the homogenizing effect narrows the scope for deliberation, right? So we sort of have both of these. This is what we should be studying, right? It's not one or the other. It's like both of these things are happening, right? And the fact that the homogenizing effect narrows the scope for deliberation is really intense political and other economic question. So it's not just that the tasks, and you say this, right? It's not just that the tasks and the interactions are streamlined in specific settings. kind of how we think about AI in the workplace, where it's like streamlined, but rather the very conditions of relation and the very conditions of coordination are reshaped. So you say that in your intro, and I was like, yes. So the one thing I was thinking, I'm curious to hear your view, and others actually, please add something if you'd like, other PERN numbers. Those conditions of relation and coordination constitute AI, right? It's not like AI is a thing, like they actually constitute AI. So I completely agree with you that AI, I'm quoting here, only becomes a thing in the world as we engage with it, right? It learns and builds from interactions, right? But I guess more than that, interfacing with AI prediction has become a condition of participating institutions, like a condition of participating in institutions. You actually also say that. I would sort of add that it entails interactions not just with users, because I think that's sort of where you stop in the book, but also interactions with data sets and other algorithms and hardware. And I don't know, the list could go on, right? And I think this is what we also as scholars should be compiling or thinking through. So in that sense, it's sort of more than a social infrastructure, right? And my question is, can we say that it's a socio-technical system, which is sort of where I would land, because technology is always already social, right? Tech isn't like embedded in the social, it's always already social. As soon as we had like this thumb and a pencil and a rock or whatever it was, and made some fire and started writing and all those things, right? All of those are social instruments, right? And they all exist in a socio-technical mode of practice. So that's sort of what I was, I'll land on. I have something else to say, but I'll leave that floor open. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate that comment, and I have many thoughts. I'm gonna start at the end, which is the socio-technical. And I'm going to see up front that, and that is also in the book, that I have a little bit of beef with the term socio-technical, which comes from almost a decade of being very active and publishing in the computer science and data science world, and sort of being, at the table as I work with computer scientists on some of these problems. And what I've seen actually, and this is maybe a little bit of a hot take, is that over the sort of almost last decade, this term has been a little bit, and I don't mean, no pun intended, but has been co-opted a little bit. And it sort of has been slapped onto a lot of thinking and doing that is very limited, very technical, and is always in service of reducing something to a technical problem. You can see that, for example, in the AI audit space, in the AI transparency space, a lot. And sort of, I talk about that a little bit in the chapter where I talk about value alignment and the problems of AI. So when I say socio-technical is problematic for me, I mean it is problematic because it has been really watered down, and it is time to recoup the idea that this is already social, because that's not what these folks mean when they say socio-technical. So that's why this paragraph is in there, and this is why I'm a little bit critical about the term socio-technical. However, I've been really, I've been thinking about this, and Lucy Suchman, who so generously blurbed my book, has sort of put her finger on this particular take as well. And it leaves the question open, what about the technical, right? Like, where does this come in? And so I'm sort of, put this out there, and we're sort of really making a big play for the social science and humanities kind of scholarship, really actively trying to intervene in that space and sort of the folks that I know. And that now leaves me conceptually with exactly the question you posed. Like, what about the technical? What about the technical to technical? What about that, especially in a world in which we now live with AI agents who hack infrastructures autonomously, right? So I think that's an open question for me that I need to really work on, and that but I wanted to give you a little bit of a this is where I'm coming from. Now, the participating in an institution, absolutely, that is the thing. And that is, I don't know if you experience this as well where you are at, but as educators, we really acutely feel that with students who are really changing behaviors, selecting courses, behaviors in classes based on sort of ideas of prediction, grade prediction, and all of that. And just this week, the University of Michigan actually said that we're not going to give grades anymore for the first year. I don't know if you saw that. They said it's due to mental health, which I think, okay, like, but those things to me are interlinked, right? The pressures of prediction. And so I think the sort of prediction as a condition or as a logic by which we can interact with institutions is the big risk and problem. And this is why I chose the word recalibration, because it's ever so slightly, right? And it's been happening for a while.
Mm.
It's not that it came with LLMs, or it's not that it came with agents.
Yeah. Can I just ask, I did see that about University of Michigan, for those who don't know, are not giving grades to students for the first semester. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how is that linked though to the question?
So what I was trying to say with that is that the idea that there's one future and we are constantly assessed for prediction, that's very apparent among students, at least in my experience,
Mm.
right? That you can really see that in behaviors and anxieties and questions. And I that kind of environment to me is, or prediction is part of the stress environment that students experience.
Mm, mm,
So this is why I brought this up.
Thank you.
There might be another hot take.
Jean,
Yeah.
do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Mona. It's really great to have access to the book early on, and also to hear, yeah, as Jake said, your really rich kind of introduction to it. So the prediction paradigm, I think, is a really evocative idea. I like that it can operate at kind of a really wide range of scales, from, kind of questions of the future of humanity and the future of work, or at a really micro scale, of course. This is how models operate. And it has really great continuity, of course, with the sort of data-driven decision-making, automated decision-making work going back decades now. But there's another world in which people use AI in the vernacular, and that's kind of internet cultures and multimedia and AI-generated content and all of that. And it kind of strikes me that there's more of an atmosphere of like chaos and mistrust, and like precisely the opposite of any kind of predictive rationality. And I was just wondering how you might, as your book talks proceed, and as you do more media and so on, how you might grapple with those kind of tensions.
That's a really great comment. Thank you for that, Gina. I appreciate that. I think that that sense of chaos, which if I understand it correctly, probably also stems from having work stolen. Is that what you're referring?
Oh no, I just mean like, I mean the emergence and proliferation of AI-generated content, as it attaches to existing dynamics and logics of platforms and cultures of the internet, misinformation, so-called AI slop, all of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Great. Thank you for that clarification. Okay. So, I am not a scholar, an internet studies scholar, and I'm not trained in media studies. I'm a sociologist, even though I'm in a media studies department. I am very interested in that and sort of working on that with a collaborator at NYU as a professor of journalism. And we are trying to figure out how AI perhaps shifts and shapes what Norton Maras, who's at Warwick, calls demarcation battles. So the sort of distinction between knowledge and anti-knowledge, specifically in the profession of journalism. And because journalists are faced with having to identify what is slop, what's not slop, what is information, misinformation. Again, this is not new, but what is new is that journalists, for example, are now enrolled in the politics of these demarcation battles more explicitly and at a more rapid scale. And it is total chaos, as you say. But what is interesting is that the tools to combat slop are also predictive. So is this slop or not? Is this real or not? Or, some universities, not here at UVA, but at some universities, faculty are asked to use AI detection systems, which are also predictive. So it's like whack-a-mole prediction, or the prediction snake eating its tail. So that's what I'm observing.
I think it's a great answer from the institutional perspective. And then there's sort of outside the institutions where maybe there are different ways of dealing with things going on. Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
I wouldn't mind going back to this sort of question of institutional participation and being forced to engage with AI as a mode of institutional participation, because that comment made me really think about how institutions themselves also feel compelled and forced to engage with AI for a range of reasons, to remain competitive, to remain lean, to realize various efficiencies, and rationalize labor, etc. And then I'm wondering, where does that compulsion come from? They don't just like look at like the technology and be like, look at what this can do. We must use it. They're subject to a range of different political forces, a range of different economic pressures, which are themselves then shaped by this whole kind of class of commercial actors who are trying to shape institutions according to their understanding of a congenial economic organization that will be profitable for them. And they evidently have the power to do so, which they accumulated through a very social process. And I suppose, I'm very convinced that the sort of analytic that I understand that the analytic that you're trying to put forward is that like we need to reintroduce the social into how we understand these technologies to operate in the world, or how we understand that we govern them. But there's also, of course, like this whole world of socioeconomic rationality and cronyism and oligarchism and political formation that's putting the downward pressure for the uptake of these technologies as well. And I think you addressed this somewhat in your book in some of the later chapters, but perhaps you could talk more about, if this is a question, if the socio-technical is not enough to describe this, and we have to like figure out what's social and what's technical and where, then perhaps you can talk us through that a little bit. And I hope that was clear enough as a question.
Thank you, Jake. Absolutely. So I have a little bit of a twofold answer to that. The first one is that the AI uptake among institutions, whether that's public, private, for-profit, non-profit, what have you, it's everywhere, I think is, first can be, or often is based on the narrative that we need prediction to make better and often more fair use of quote unquote scarce resources. So resources are scarce. We need prediction to do more with the few resources we have. Or we need to make what we have more efficient, and we need prediction for that so we can turn a profit. Those narratives sort of permeate everywhere. And the interesting bit is that there is still no proof that that is actually true. Still, I submitted the manuscript a year ago, and like we still don't have actually any proof that AI prediction is making a measurable difference in institutions and organizations. What I'm interested in, or what I want to sort of tease out or see when I say the social, is the stories that we tell each other about people and their work with machines to rationalize the embedding of AI systems. For example, and I just use, again, the university as an example. We're implementing a new system here. at the University of Virginia that is likely going to have a predictive function that is supposed to help advising professors mentor students into the right classes. So there's a predictive function in here that is based on a social story, right? On a story about how we relate to students, how students relate to us, what careers look like, how students get jobs, and so forth. So in other words, I'm not disagreeing with you, with cronyism and oligarchy and all of that. I'm just trying to get at the sort of social by way of stories about the social. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I suppose I just, find myself in my own work, for instance, with different aspects of the Australian government, where I run into people who run departments, for instance, who are so brutally underfunded and will make sort of budget appeals for staff, which they don't get, but they do get budget if they ask for IT spend. And they get that little bit of money and they're like, well, I'm an ombudsman. I'm receiving, 5,000 complaints a month. And now I've only got, 4.2 staff to triage and then run those complaints. How can I not use an automated triage system? Like, I just have to. And these people are very critical of AI. They're very critical of like techno capital. They're very critical of the way in which big tech sort of is mediating the fabric of governance. But they're kind of left with no choice because their bosses are like, well, this is how we're going to do it now. And their bosses are saying that because they've, read a magazine on an airplane telling them that, it's a Deloitte ad telling them that that AI is the way that everything's gonna work. So, they're also fully aware that there is no repeatable benchmark for efficiency or productivity uplift in their space, but they kind of have they're the ones who kind of have no choice, I suppose. Yeah. And I'm interested in where that feeling of no choice comes from. It's kind of this double thing. There's like no choice about using it, and then once we're using it, then the no choice about the future emerges. But maybe some people, there's this multiple registers of having no choice, which I guess is a little
Yes.
bit overwhelming.
I agree with that. 100%. I'm sure them. Do you want me to?
No, you don't feel compelled to answer. It looks like we've got a few people who are up for saying something.
Okay.
Victoria, do you want to go?
Okay.
Sure. I would like to return to your response to Janet's comment. And I should say that I haven't read the whole book, so this is based mostly on reading chapter 3. But your exchange with Janet sort of hit a nerve with the way I was reading chapter 3. And I think it's your reluctance, as I heard it in responding to Janet, to go to the socio-technical, that you want to, in some sense at least, keep open the technical to technical. And as I understand the project from what your introduction as well is sort of a reassertion of a social, but that so the reassertion of the social is also not presented as a socio-technical. So there's a kind of a splitting of the technical and the social that runs through your presentation, and that I felt was strongly there in chapter 3. And in there, it was about the sort of framing in terms of directionality and practices. So the directionality is in some sense the more technical side. I think a sort of a linearity that runs through the things you draw on: bureaucracy, rules, classification, standardization, which you read as fairly linear. And then but you keep room for practices which will fuzz them up in a social way. Whereas So I was also a little put off by your saying no one cares about infrastructure. That is one of my deep loves. So I have thought a lot about bureaucracy, rules, classification, and standardization. And I would say there's sort of widespread research on the fact that they are never simply linear. So I was thinking of Matthew Hull's stuff on bureaucracy. A very small one, but that has come up in Pern, is the stuff about, you just mentioned it in passing, so not trying to hold you to account to it in a big way, but the standardization of shoes. So there's lots of really terrific work, I think, done looking at production processes in China. I'm thinking of Claudio Benzacrai's book called Perfect Fit, which shows that in fact most of the shoe production in China is done with a foot model, and that companies are attached to quite particular foot models, and that a size 6 for Mephisto is not the size 6 for Clark's. So they're different women, different feet, different, whatever the plural is. And that has some intuitive resonance for me about why some brands feel better to each of us than another. I think it's because we're matching with the foot model, not because of anything to do with the linearity and standardization. So what I'm wondering is, how wedded are you? I was going to ask this anyway, but your answer to Janet makes me think that you are quite deeply wedded to separating out directionality and practices. And isn't it practices all the way down? And so that the idea that there is something that is a prediction in a narrow sense ends up being more of a straw person in a way that, so I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about directionality and practices and how that plays out in the rest of the book. Maybe it plays out completely differently than in chapter 3.
And I'm so sorry to do this, Mona, because I know you're about to say something, but there's someone in the chat.
Sorry, I haven't posted it. I wrote it down.
Oh, okay, good. Bernardo in the chat said, just because it's an iteration of what Vicky just said, I just want to make sure I understand your argument correctly. I've not read the book yet. Your prediction paradigm describes AI as imposing a linear temporality in which the past predicts the future. But if AI predictions increasingly intervene in and reorganize social life, doesn't the process become recursive? The predictive future changes the present. It subsequently becomes the data for the next prediction. ? And there's a relationship to what Vicky's saying, slightly different, but in that sense, might AI simultaneously impose linearity epistemically while producing recursive temporality socially? So yeah, there's a similar point there, but yes.
Okay. I'm gonna add that to my post-it. All right. Thank you so much. Vicky, I really appreciate that. And you put your finger on a conceptual tension that I've since more explicitly grappled with since I finished the book. Sometimes you have to, I always write to think. And I've been thinking through this, and I've been really thinking about time and the sort of wondering where the sort of reduction comes from, which I do think comes from prediction, not in a divination sense, but in the sort of linear time regime, and that being very explicit in data science and AI research. I sit in the School of Data Science, and this is what it is. A past predicts a future. I think that the directionality element is really putting the linear time regime, that's the linear time regime, the direction from past to future. That's the directionality element. And it means that, folks with certain pasts have certain predicted futures. Again, and we've sort of talked about this as bias in the fair, accountable, and transparent AI research. But I think it's this sort of idea, this one world, one past, one future idea. That's the directionality. That's what I was trying to get at. But the question that Jake asked earlier about why are people pressured? Why do they have no choice to embed AI systems? That's the sort of practice part, as is the part of designing and evaluating these kinds of systems, which I talk about in other parts of the book as well. The choices, the assumptions, the classifications, that's what I was trying to get at with the social practice part. So they're not, I see the tension, but they conceptually, strictly speaking, but they go together for me because the practices assume this linearity. My data science colleagues don't necessarily think about different futures. Like, it's really about boxing data in so that prediction can happen in the most accurate way, hopefully in a fair, quote unquote, fair kind of way. So I don't know if that makes sense, that this is how I sort of relate these to one another. When it comes to the recursive part, yes, absolutely. And, Jason Sadowski, who probably all of you sort of know, and or whose work you may know, talks about the sort of convergence around the mean in that way, the sort of narrowing down of possibilities around the mean because of predictive logics that are sort of beginning to govern social life. So I think the prediction goes into the past, but I still think we deal with the linear idea. I don't think AI can be had without that linearity.
I see Michael maybe has a comment, but I just want to add in there. There is a comment in the chat that asks, is not all positive science anchored on a predictive linear logic? And to your point of these things going together, I do think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that, yes, the data scientific practice is about generating predictions from a sort of snapshot of the past, and that's a way of sort of rationalizing the future into a narrower set of choices. But that is also indeed the institutional logic, which is about extracting discretion from individual humans in order to realize efficiency. So you just like perform the cognitive work in a computational apparatus in order to limit the scope of choices. So, there's so many forces that are organizing themselves around this particular goal. Again, don't feel the need to compel you to respond. You can if you want, otherwise we'll jump to Michael.
I can respond quickly by saying I'm not anti-prediction generally. I am critical of the prediction paradigm as this organizing principle and institutional principle. Prediction can be very useful in STEM, for example, right? It helps us develop drugs. It helps us make bridges that don't collapse. It helps us do amazing things, keep placing, all these kinds of things. I start the book with the sort of Carnap quote, and sort of where I say, well, prediction used to be, we used to think of that as something useful, right? As something that's useful for sort of engineering STEM sort of problems. And it's sort of escaped and it become the sort of social governing principle. It can be wonderful and useful. But it has to sort of be thought of as an instrument. I talk about that in the conclusion, and as more technical in certain ways, right? So to sort of push it back and really put a utility frame on it. And I don't think we're headed that way. I don't know if you saw, but AlphaFold was just shut down because it's not turning a profit. So that is, those forces are colliding in a way.
Thanks, Mona, for today and for the book. for others on the call, Mona was kind enough to share the book just as it was coming out, and I was writing a new course, and so I was able to set one of the chapters for my students, and it really helped them a lot, I think, to understand the predictive logics built into the AI systems that they're encountering, and I think was quite pivotal to their learning in the course. So thank you. Big thumbs up as a teaching text, as well as a provocative one for the conversation. I wanted to kind of push you a little on the question of the future and what is going on in the prediction of futures. You've kind of said, a few times, and it's in the book too, of course, that predictive systems are about generating like one future, like making a claim, like this is the future that will occur, in this, according to this data system. And then set that against, of course, the fact that like futures are always uncertain and always unfolding. I think that there's maybe something important in the point that Jake was making about the iterative around prediction. And I think to come back to students, for example, the way people work with a chatbot, for instance, to like do research or to develop a text, perhaps very much against their assessment rules, but to develop a text is iterative. They're like the text. You prompt the chatbot, it generates a future in the form of a text output, and then that's tweaked and modified and so on. So there's one future being produced, but it's iterative. But I guess on a larger level, I'm kind of really interested in the contestation over futures, because of course, like there's not one AI system producing like one future. There's many systems producing many different futures, often all in the same scenario or context. You deal with like whether it's an academic like outlining a paper, a student generating their essay, or business decisions being proposed, or in those examples of like uses in science and so on. There's like many futures being generated and proposed, and it's like which one is going to get taken up and made. And then the broader question of like, well, what is a future that is built? What is a future at the sort of social and political level for a world that's like built around predictive systems? Does the system then become do systems that do the prediction become kind of the engines of power? And I guess to land on some of the questions that come up in a lot of the Pern events that I've been part of is the question of like, well, to what end and to what value and to whose benefit? And so I guess I'm also really interested in the question of like who benefits from becoming the tools or becoming the owners or becoming the infrastructures of doing prediction. And like, how does being able to tame uncertain futures and make them into solid things that you can then act upon and capitalize upon, how does that generate like power, wealth, value, benefit? How does it induce harm and so on? And so I guess like I'm wondering, like, for you as you lay out the prediction paradigm, the question is like, okay, so then what is happening at that level of taming futures, of capitalizing upon them, of like turning the many uncertain, endless possibilities of the future into one knowable and actionable thing that can then generate value or enable power. So I guess it's a question about like, how does condensing many futures into one accrue power in certain ways, and how does it produce kind of value or benefit?
Okay, great. Good to meet you here in person, Michael, and thank you for your
Yeah, you too.
All right, so I'm going to start with the last one. So I think you can see that when you open the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg, or just open any daily, and you look at what's happening in the US with regards to what is now called AI infrastructure investment, the circular deal making, and all of that. The highly speculative building of data centers everywhere, the aiming for IPOs, Anthropic, OpenAI, and so forth, and sort of the literally capitalizing on this big promise that AI infrastructure is needed for that one future that is definitely going to occur. I wrote a follow-up paper to this book with Emmanuel Moss, thinking through what it would look like if we were to classify AI as a public utility and a common carrier, which is a special sort of designation here in the US. It's called a beta burst. It's on SSRN. And we looked at the railroad bubble at the turn of the previous century, and it was quite similar. Speculative infrastructural investment by private actors, and the bubble burst, and the government had to step in, and regulations we still benefit from were developed at that moment in time. The common carrier designation amongst them. So I think this is quite literally what is happening right now. You can watch this every day. There's a new thing that is happening. And I think that a lot of the narratives and assumptions about the social, how people work, how society works, what are the conditions of access, those stories are being told in part to facilitate this rapid infrastructural and highly speculative build out that we're seeing. This is US specific. I'm talking US specific. Europe is taking a different approach. For example, I'm not sure what the approach is in Australia or other places. So that's my answer to that question. Then the iteration part and the sort of the little predicted future is in the social practice, just to Vicky's earlier point. Yes, I absolutely see that. I also see that can be very generative. However, there is a difference between retaining an understanding of that multiple things are possible and exploration is still possible versus just deploying a chatbot and then submitting that as your final paper. Does that make sense? Like, you are still sort of, in the former example, you're still sort of wrangling the machine, and we can talk about whether that is particularly meaningful or should be the goal of education or any of that. But I think there's still like a little bit of an essence of that there is agency and the multiple possibilities. Again, what we're seeing, and certainly at this university, and this may be the case in other universities in the United States and Australia, Asia as well, we are seeing a return to no tech classrooms, no phone classrooms, handwritten exams, all of those things. So there is my prediction is that we're going to see, a renaissance of the social sciences and humanities, which is a reaction to the prediction paradigm. So
can I jump? Sorry, Mona. Can I jump in there? Like, absolutely. I was just in a meeting yesterday about in classroom assignments with pen and paper, pencil and paper, in an economics department. And where much of what economists do actually can be replaced by AI today. Don't tell them I said that. But I guess there's two things though, right? Like, one is what you just said, and then the other is, I think, how I'm hearing Michael, what Michael said has many dimensions, so in a good way, is that, like, there's all this output, there's all the models out there, right? All across the globe. I mean, I know we're very US centric, but still across the globe, and all the output based on a very probabilistic, token, probabilistic, linear, predictive practice. And then there's the adjudication that has to happen. Right? That's actually, I agree with you about the return of the humanities and the social sciences, because if AI models definitely can do the kind of work that economists are doing, let's say right now, and I actually firmly believe this. They're modeling and they're doing regression analyses. But at the same time, then, if you're sitting, in the ministry of whatever, and the economist, the AI economist is producing output, how is this then being, applied or financed as an actual policy or project in a community? Right. That is where the social sciences and humanities, I absolutely agree, are, and other people write, a lot of people in philosophy are writing about this right now, where our forms of reasoning that we think, are in the dustbin of history are actually not, which is good news. But yes, I think that's slightly different from, anyway, I'm just adding into the mix here. Yeah.
Can I very briefly add on there to say, I was thinking about in finance and like high-speed algorithmic trading, AI-driven trading, where you have extremely fast, extremely tight window, very short run predictions being generated machinically all the time, right? And then acted upon, and then they interlay and compete with one another as all of these systems are attempting to kind of leverage these tiny bits of futurity that you can extract value from by, like, you know, arbitraging price differences and so on. So like, I think there's two these like examples where it's precisely the uncertainty and the way in which that can be leveraged for gain that's at stake, where like actually generating and acting upon and nudging many futures very rapidly, all contesting at the same time, becomes a site of value. And that's an interesting dimension of prediction and around AI. But I'll shush now because I think
Can I just jump onto that? Yes, absolutely. And what the interesting bit to me, and again, like I sort of grab my sociology hat here, is what are the ways in which folks then set out to manipulate what they think influences the prediction, right? And how what gains can be had from that. We're seeing that here, for example, in the US with prediction markets and sort of that because always having been unruly in a way, but really focus being on how can the prediction be manipulated so that individual gains can be made on that. And so we can think that more broadly, even, I believe.
Linda, do
Um,
you want to go ahead?
yeah, I'll jump in. It's a little bit on a different kind of revisiting maybe an earlier thread that I guess for context, I am coming from an information science background and with heavy heart, like understand what you mean when you're talking about slapping socio-technical on things as a way to sort of continually focus on technological reforms, basically. So I understand sort of that context, and it makes me wonder more generally if, like, the extent to which the audience for this book or some of these arguments is is that data science community, is the prediction makers, is a very technical community. I mean, I would guess most the sociology community doesn't need to be told to attend to sort of like the social aspects of AI. And it's making I don't know. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, but I sort of relatedly, I'm thinking that nonetheless, what seems most important about what you're describing as a social phenomenon here, the prediction paradigm, is, even the beginning where you talk about the oracle and like this extremely long-standing cultural predilection towards prediction. It feels like the part that's different or that's changed is the technological part. So essentially so much of this book really builds on really robust literatures in quantification, classification, standardization, as I think Jean mentioned. Algorithms, even paper-based algorithms, have been running our society for quite a long time. And it feels like the different thing now is as you mentioned in some points, like maybe there's an acceleration that's happening through sort of a changing technological apparatus. And so I guess I just was like, I still, even though I'm, like, as I mentioned, sympathetic to, not wanting to do this sort of like, let's just only focus on, I understand where you're coming from with that, trying to avoid the focus on the technical. At the same time, I feel like so much of the thing that feels worrisome right now is the technical, and in particular the mismatch between a system that's been extremely optimized for more and more accurate predictions, where the accuracy of that prediction is defined in a lab by technical folks and is like completely divorced from any particular social context. And so what's happening here when your prediction machine like doesn't account for any kind of social context? And and then it's almost like a lab leak phenomena. You then apply that thing that's optimized to be accurate in a void in a social context. And so, I feel like there's even an element here of like when we're talking about this inevitability or what's happening with the technical, I almost feel like what you're describing is the work specifically being done by sort of these technical communities. And so I don't know, I'd be curious how you're thinking of how being in a particular kind of department, thinking of that audience is like really shaping a lot of the arguments you're making in this book.
So this is first of all, thank you. Glad to see an information scientist. This book is an academic trade. So it's written for a general audience, and is for, really anyone to read. It's deliberately written in a very accessible way, and it's trying to work to get a relatively complex idea across to this broader audience. It is definitely shaped by positionality, which is a decade in engineering environments. Absolutely. However, what I do see is a rhetoric that has been adapted by the general public that is technical. And I explain that, for example, when I talk about the black box, when the narrative is, the math black box is so complex we cannot explain the math. That's why we can't explain the system. And I say we can absolutely explain the system by explaining the social. Why do we even feel the need that we need to create quote unquote AI transparency that explains very complex math? It's obvious to social scientists, of course, but I don't see that being obvious in the socio-technical discourse or in the general discourse. And that's what worries me because, and I say this in the book as well, I think we all are experts because we're infrastructurally entangled with prediction already and have been for years now. And we sort of kind of know what is happening, right? We know what's happening with AI prediction in our institutions, in our intimate lives, in our family lives, in our professional lives, and so on. And so that's that's the sort of drive behind it, that we sort of own that a little bit more, and that's why I go on about the social, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think this is the moment that the AI application has been kind of driving or spearheaded towards general use. Yeah, so that's also one dimension. Implication-wise, AI has been largely being social. And I think this book, Mona, definitely very powerful and introduce us to this prediction perspective. It's kind of a very gentle yet very forceful reminder. Oh, everybody's talking about human AI interaction, but this kind of interaction is largely kind of AI oriented prediction. So I guess that's kind of the most important takeaway for me, and I would definitely introduce this to our students here in Shanghai. By the way, I really like the book cover. Very intriguing.
Thank you. All credit to Kevin who created it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, speaking of this general use versus like specialized applications of AI, I think because I'm really interested in the social studies of fintech, so I always pay attention to the financial consequences of big data technology, AI technology, and I think in finance, this idea of prediction has been kind of long-standing norm. For example, George Lawyer worked on how credit card actually predict and also define social economic classes. And also Marianne Foucault talking about ordinal citizens, right? So this is all about the critiques towards big data technology. And I think this prediction actually is kind of something shows us the continuity of predictive technology in finance, ranging from big data era to the AI era. So I guess the next step or in the future, there will be more work looking into the financial application of AI, from this predictive or prediction perspective. One thing I feel like very interesting is that Janet just recommended this book, Christine Bork's The Trading Beyond Understanding. Actually, through from those interviews, we see that the traders who are using AI technology or being forced to use AI technology, a lot of them are actually very scared about prediction because they don't know how this kind of prediction mechanism got enabled and what kind of consequences will it be engender. So this is also about the plurality of prediction. So in a big data era, we sort of see that okay, the institutional structure actually will homogenize everything, and the future will be singularized. But now we see that, at least at this moment, we see that actually the institutional forces at different levels actually are taking different or diversified attitudes toward prediction. So that's also something I think very interesting. Okay, so I guess my question is, do you have any recommendations or kind of any thoughts about the specialized use of AI on the prediction perspective? Not necessarily finance, but like in addition to your like this deep research on general use of AI, what are the kind of social, political, cultural consequences of AI in specific domains?
Thank you so much, Jing. I so appreciate all you said. I really do. I will add, say one thing that you didn't ask me about, which is, I think there's a lot to learn from spaces in which prediction and automated prediction has been infrastructural for a while, especially when it comes to regulation. So is there a way in which we can look to the financial sector and look to how prediction was perhaps or is perhaps regulated in some way within that, or what are the social consequences of that prediction? Because we're still sort of swimming in a sort of soup, at least here in the US, where there's a decided pushback against regulation, but also an acknowledgement that some sort of ordering has to happen, right? Some sort of governance has to be implemented. And I think, yeah, I would be curious to hear from you. What are the ways in which this perhaps has happened in the financial sector? Then to your question, I am extremely interested in professional discretion and automated prediction. I've been working on that for a while. Like the vignettes that you read about recruiting are from research I started about 5 years ago on the use of AI in recruiting specifically. So not HR, so actually, gatekeeping the labor market, if you will. And journalists, that's the other project I spoke about. That's work with Hilke. In the future, I'm really interested in sort of this kind of stuff, which is these biometric trackers and prediction for prediction logics for professional athletes and the ways in which their discretion around their body and their training shifts and changes with the predictions that these trackers produce, for example. And there are a few other domains that I'm sort of thinking about I might sort of put together. So that's like the future work. But yeah, professional discretion is something I'm really interested in.
Very, very interesting. Would love to stay in touch. We're working on a prompt engineering research, like the definition of this occupation on LinkedIn. Yeah, so yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing your future research agenda, Mona.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Jing. Thanks, Mona. I'm gonna turn to the chat because we'll give you a transcript of the chat and everything because there's some really wonderful comments in there as well. But as we're approaching the end of our session, it's might be good. There's actually a couple of questions in there, but perhaps we'll ask the one that's sort of most representative of a few of those questions, because I do think, there's an interesting question about AI and class warfare, but this one is this question about AI, AGI and superintelligence perhaps rolls that up into it as well in an interesting way. So there is a question from the chat from Asher Titus that I'll read out, which says, "Hi Mona, AI's social infrastructure is a great insight. Your characterization of AI as data-driven wrangling of billions of data points to produce predictions for how they'll behave in the future with the kind of scientific homogenizing certainty is definitely disturbing. I can see how it very accurately describes narrow AI, ML, and generative AI. The question is, do you have a view on the coming of the so-called artificial general intelligence or superintelligence and the euphoria around it in the industry and in some policymaking circles? What kind of social futures are the next suite of AI technologies trying to create and imagine?"
Thank you for that. I do think that AGI, general artificial intelligence, is deliberately kept a moving target. We don't have a definition. I don't think there's a desire to have a definition of that. It helps rationalize these insane venture capital investments in circular deal-making that we are seeing. If you've read Karen Howe's book, Empire of AI, you get a little bit of a taste of the different cultural camps that are part of this sort of AGI agenda. I highly recommend that book. I think it is the sort of the end times are coming narrative is eschatological, and I'm working with a student actually on sort of the religious undertones of this whole AGI discourse that we're seeing. I don't know what AGI is or what it would look like. I do think, however, that AI agents, the ones that we've seen in the press over the last couple of weeks, pose very serious security risks to the digital infrastructures that we do have. I am very worried about the fact that these come out of quote unquote frontier labs and not out of companies that have larger companies that have more established safety and governance and R&D cultures and protocols. I don't think that's coincidental that this is an OpenAI whoopsie that happened. And I worry about that, which I think is very different from AGI. I think the future of AI is in utility. I think the future of AI is especially in STEM science. I think we can see leaps. I think the AI industry is now recognizing that. And I think what we're going to see is mega IPOs. Who knows what's going to happen to the global economy? But then the next thing is AI for science and in STEM. And we've seen, for example, last week, Daphne and a couple of others have left Google after many years and are starting an AI for science focused startup. We've seen the takedown of AlphaFold to put it back on the proprietary hood and these kind of things. So that's my quote unquote prediction. For the future, I do think AI is infrastructure. And I think other places outside of the United States have understood that and are already putting that in place, amongst them China, European countries, and so forth.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think we can end there with both these predictions for the future and sort of the more general question of, what are the socio-technical inflections of the engineering practices when you think you're building God, which is probably a bit of a
Or
like
the end times.
yeah, exactly. But it's been such a wonderful discussion, and it's been so great to have you and hear about your work and your book. And we wish you all the best with it, and I hope it becomes a gigantic hit. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for your really smart questions and comments. And thank you to Pern and ADM+S for hosting us. We will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Juan.
So appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Talk soon.